Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our academic writing and research course. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about qualitative research methods. Specifically, we're going to talk about interviews. Now, we're going to talk about the three main types of interviews, and then we're going to talk about some less common styles of interviews that you might not be familiar with. We're going to talk about when you'll use these, and we're going to talk about different types of language that you might use while you're working with an interviewee. So stay tuned to find out all the language that you're going to need. And please remember to like, subscribe, and comment on my video. So when we talk about quantitative research, we're looking at statistical analysis. When we're talking about qualitative research, we're talking about an effort to develop rich data. We're looking for a deeper understanding of the subject matter. And interviews are a critical part of qualitative researchers' tools. So there are three overarching types of interviews, and the different types of interviews that we're going to talk about today fall into one of these three categories. The first is a structured interview. The second is a semi-structured interview. And the third is an unstructured interview. So, as the name indicates, a structured interview, you have a set list of questions and you're going to ask those same questions in the same order to your interviewee. You're semi-structured, you're going in with some questions, but you're also remaining flexible. You're going to allow the answer that your interviewee gives to dictate what follow-up questions you might ask so you can get a better understanding of the topic. And an unstructured interview is completely that. There's no structure, there's no plan as you go in. You're simply letting the interviewee dictate how the interview is going to proceed. And we're going to talk about some different styles of interviews, like life history and narrative interviews, where you might take an unstructured approach. So let's take a look at each of these three types of interviews. So I explained a little bit about what each of these is. We would use a structured interview when we really need to be consistent across a large number of participants. A semi-structured interview, as I said, we want to remain flexible. We've prepared a list of core questions. We're trying to get at our research questions with these interview questions we've prepared, but we're leaving ourselves the flexibility to ask follow-up questions that are based on the interviewee's response. And our unstructured are far more flexible. We're going to start with something like, tell me about a time, tell me about your journey, tell me about something in your life. And as we can see here on the right, that's the degree of structure in each interview. So when we talk about language, we can ask some very open-ended questions like, can you tell me more about? We very often will use this with follow-up questions. When an interviewer gives us or an interviewee gives us an answer, and we want to get more information from them, we might say, tell me more about this. How did this affect you, right? We want more description, more detail. I'm going to jump here to probing and prompting questions. What happened after that? This is very common in narrative interviews and life history interviews because we don't want to really control the direction of the interview. We want the interviewee to control that direction. We're simply encouraging them to continue. Why do you think that is? I wouldn't even go into that in a life history or narrative interview. I would simply let the interviewee control the context of that interview. But that might be a follow-up question, a probing question that you might ask in a more semi-structured interview. Clarifying questions, we often use this and then we often follow it up with paraphrasing. So when we want to ensure that we understand exactly what the interviewee is saying, we can say, do you mean? Can you explain a little bit more about that? And then we would say, so what I hear you saying is, I think this is really important when we think we've got a very critical piece of qualitative data that we're going to use, just to ensure that what we're hearing is exactly what our interviewee is intending to say, because we might be interpreting their response differently than what they actually mean. So let's look at some less common types of interviews, and they all fall under the umbrella of structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews. The first is a narrative interview. The next is an ethnographic interview, a life history interview, and an elite interview. So I know I've spoken about a narrative and a life history interview in this video. Have you ever heard of any of these? And think about, even if you haven't heard of them, you've probably heard some phrases like ethnographic, right? Ethnographic or ethnography is a type of research study where we immerse ourselves in a situation and we observe things in their natural setting. So we're going to talk a little bit about what makes each of these unique. So in a narrative interview, you're focusing on the participant telling a story. Narrative means story, where it's not so exhaustive as a life history interview, but in this style of interview, the interviewee is sharing a particular experience. So it could be your experiences as a second language writer. It could be your experiences as a refugee in a refugee camp, something like that. So again, we're allowing the interviewee to control, to dictate how this interview is going to proceed. We're listening more than we're leading. So when we're talking about identity, meaning making, life transitions, major events that we want to capture, we're going to use this style of interview. So let's talk about some of the different language that you might see, right? Can you tell me the story of how you became interested in teaching? And then we want to simply prompt. We want to say, what happened next? Then what happened? So we want to avoid probing questions again because we want that interviewee to control the interview. In an ethnographic interview, this is often informal and it's conducted in the field. It's embedded within participant observation. So if you look at this picture here, the two people sitting down and chatting, that's probably not the best picture to represent an ethnographic interview. This would be something that while you're in the field observing, you might ask very informal questions. You're not going to say, okay, let's sit down for a 35 or 40-minute interview. You're going to be doing this over time in the field. It's usually for that long-term immersive research, anthropology, cultural studies. And let's look at some different types of questions that we might see. What usually happens here on a typical day? How do you usually do this? Why is this important for the community? How has this changed over time? And what are the challenges for the community or the organization? Okay, so the idea behind an ethnographic interview is you're trying to enrich the data that you've already gathered from your observation, right? You're immersed in that field within that research setting, and now you want to ask questions to deepen your understanding of what you've observed. Life history interviews are quite deep. They're chronological, and they're usually an exploration of a participant's entire life or a major part of it. It could be their career, if they've spent 40 years with a particular company or in a particular field. If it is an illness that's defined their career or their life or a certain significant period of their life, you would use this type of interview. Um, when you're doing research on personal development, trauma, historical context, we very often use life history interviews. So let's take a look at some of the language we might see here. Let's start at the beginning. Where were you born and raised? What are your earliest memories of? What kinds of values and traditions were important to you? Can you tell me about relationships or people who've been important in your life? Looking back, are there moments or events that changed the course of your life? So you're really looking to get a complete understanding. What encapsulates this person? Now, this looks as though the interviewer has a slightly more active role in the interview than in a narrative interview. And I would say that's accurate. In a life history interview, especially if you're covering a person's career, you want to make sure that you're able to move them through that history, through that time period. And very often you're covering a significant time period. So you're going to have to ask some pointed questions that are transitioning the person from one phase to the next. But at the end of the day, you still want them to tell their story. And finally, elite interviews. So when we talk about elite interviews, we're talking about interviews with people who are considered elites. They're in positions of power or influence. So this could be politicians, policymakers, executives in a company, academics, or community leaders. So I think this is really difficult. We need to think about the challenges that interviewing these types of people might present and the skills that you should possess as an interviewer. So I think this is all about balance. You have to be professional, you have to be respectful, and you have to remain flexible. So you're going to blend in those structured questions with the open-ended follow-up questions. Now you have to remember you're asking questions, but very often this person's going to have a specific set of knowledge that you likely don't fully understand, and that may prevent you from asking the appropriate questions. So you need to give that person the flexibility to share what they think is important. You also have to remember that you need to be respectful. These are people in positions of power. And this isn't like interviewing a student where if this student drops out, you've got 500 or 1,000 other students that you can interview. You really need this person to see the interview through. Just like anyone you would interview, you want this person to understand that if for any reason they feel uncomfortable, they're free not to continue at any time. But you also want to take steps to ensure that this person wants to continue the interview. Because as I said, you usually only have one bite at the apple with people like this. You want to make sure that you're getting the information that you need from a source that may otherwise be difficult to access. So we would ask questions like, I may ask some open-ended questions, but feel free to take the conversation in the direction you feel is most important. So you're giving that person that power, that authority. What do you see as the most significant changes in your field? What are the current priorities or strategic goals for your organization or community? What recent decisions have had the greatest impact and what informed those decisions? That's a terrific question. What trends do you see shaping the future of your field, your industry? What advice would you give someone entering the field right now? And then, very important, is there anything I haven't asked that you think is important to add? So you're giving that person the freedom, the flexibility to bring the conversation, the interview in the direction that they think is most important. Okay, so I want you to think about the different interview techniques we covered, and I want you to think about which would be most appropriate to your research context and why. Okay, so jot down which style you would like to use and how it could best help you. Think also about the challenges you would face using this style of interviewing and how you would address those challenges. And also, what opportunities are there? Why is this such a powerful tool? Okay. So, for your homework, you can choose one interview style. And if you have someone you can work with, you can interview a peer or create a list of interview questions. And you're going to create those questions based on your field of study or your topic of interest. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we can use formal language as an interviewer. And I've got a very, very short interview here, and the researcher is using very informal language. So why you choose this major? And he says, I always like biology and I want to help people. Okay, you always like biology. Could you explain more about that? Yeah, in high school I had a great teacher. He made it fun. Right. And what else made you want to help people? My grandmother was sick a lot. I wanted to do something that mattered. Did you consider other majors or was this your first choice? I thought about chemistry, but it was too hard. Okay, so you say chemistry was too hard. So right off the bat here, we're going to want to correct the grammar, but I would say, um, so what led you to pursue biology as a major, or what made you interested in biology in the first place? Now, we want to be formal because we want to present ourselves as a professional. We also want to show the person we're interviewing that we value their time and that this is an important endeavor. But we also don't want to be so formal that we make the interviewee uncomfortable. We want them to feel comfortable opening up to us. Here, the researcher says, okay, so you always liked biology. Could you explain more about that? Yeah, I think this is an attempt at active listening. I might say, oh, that's interesting. Um, you were always interested in biology. What was it that always made you interested in this field of study? And he says, yeah, in high school I had a great teacher. He made it fun. You could say, instead of right, you could say, oh, I understand, or oh, yes, that's very helpful. And here he says, and what else made you want to help people? We're really transitioning here away from his first answer to the second part of his answer. I might say, oh, I understand. Or a good teacher is really important. You also mentioned the desire to help people. What led to this desire to help others? Participant says, my grandmother was sick a lot. I want to do something that mattered. He says, did you consider other majors or was this your first choice? I think that question is perfect, just the way it is. The participant says, I thought about chemistry, but it was too hard. Again, you could practice active listening and say, I understand. That's reasonable or that's understandable. You might say, so you chose biology because chemistry was too difficult. Or you might ask a probing question and say, what was it that made biology easier for you than chemistry? Okay, so again, for your homework, you can work on a list of interview questions, create a particular script for the topic that you're studying or a field that you're interested in. So thank you so much for joining us. Okay, and I will see you in our next lesson at the Language Arts Gallery.